Bibles to the book of 1 Corinthians. We are continuing in our sermon series, Messy Church. If you would like a Bible to walk through the text with us, there are some Bibles out on the welcome table you can grab. And as I mentioned last week, there was a request for some adult coloring pages of the sermon artwork, and they are back there too. So, if you need a coloring page, go for it. So those are available there. All right. Well, so when Whitney and I first got married, Whitney had a cat, and so I inherited a cat into our marriage, and her name was Ellie, but we called her Smash Face because this was Ellie. She was a Persian cat. She was also like the runt, so she was like 3 pounds, and we would have to get her shaved because her hair would get so matted, so she looked like kind of a rat. And she always looked like this, just always angry. Now, she was real sweet, and actually her show of affection was to headbutt you, but she was 3 pounds, so it didn't hurt. So her and baby Tycho would headbutt all the time, and it was very cute. But she always looked angry and mean. And the reality is, she just had this posture that looked not welcoming, not inviting. And here's my concern for the church. My concern for the church is that sometimes this is the face we give the world. Like, hey, if you come in, we might be real sweet and kind, but we kind of look at the rest of the world like this. We're like, sinners. Out there doing your sin thing. We don't like you. That we just have this unwelcoming appearance to the world. Now, instead, the Apostle Paul in this chapter is going to call us to be a hospitable church. To be a hospitable church. To be a place of welcome. In 1 Corinthians 10, the end of 1 Corinthians 10, this whole section that we've been in, 8 through 10, Paul ends it this way. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Don't give offense to Jews or Gentiles or the church of God. I too try to please everyone in everything I do. I don't just do what is best for me. I do what is best for others so that many may be saved. Now, we've been in this section, 1 Corinthians 8 through 10. We've been looking at the wisdom that Paul gives us around what do we do with food that has been sacrificed to idols. And again, you're like, wait a second, that doesn't really apply very well in our context. But Paul very clearly says, whether you eat or drink, so he's referring to this whole question, or whatever you do. So it's very applicable to us. Whatever you do, you're going to act in this certain way. And there's been 3 situations that the church is facing that Paul is kind of addressing. And it is that when in the ancient world, and in Corinth in particular, there were lots of temples, right? And the main temple in Corinth was to Aphrodite, or Venus, the Roman name for Aphrodite. And so this is the goddess of love. And there was lots of cultic prostitution, as well as sacrifices to idols that would happen in the temple. And after meat was sacrificed to the idol, you would bring whatever it was, and it was killed, and part of it was burned to the god. Then there was part that was given to the temple attendants, those who worked in the temple, to have their livelihood off of that. And then there was still a lot left over, and so there were a number of situations that would occur. One is that there would be meals at the temple. And this was basically like an ancient restaurant, right? Like people would gather together for this meal. And there was an issue in the church of those within the church going to these temple meals. And so Paul is addressing that. That's one of the situations. After that was done, there would still be leftover meat, and it was put in the marketplace and sold. And so the question was, are Christians allowed to eat meat that is sold in the marketplace that might have been sacrificed to an idol? So those are 2 of the 3 questions. Can I eat meat in the temple? Can I eat meat that is sold in the marketplace? And then finally, one other way that would happen is if I took some of that meat back to my home and then offered a meal in my home. Am I allowed to go as a Christian to this place with meat that may have been sacrificed to an idol? So these are the three questions. Now, Paul's going to give specific answers to those three things in 1 Corinthians 10. So I want to walk through with you what are the answers that Paul gives, and then I want to back up to say, what principles can we learn about how he answers those questions in order for us to be a hospitable church? Because he ends it with this idea that this is what he wants the church to live out: hospitality. So the first question, can I eat at the temple? His answer to this is, that's not where I wanted to go. His answer to this is no. So, my dear friends, flee from the worship of idols. Flee from the worship of idols. He goes on a little bit later to say, what am I trying to say? Am I saying that food offered to idols has some significance, or that idols are real gods? Remember, he talked about this in chapter 8. Part of their argument was, we know that idols aren't real. We're just going and eating some meat. What's the big deal, Paul? He's like, no. I agree that idols are not real. There's nothing happening here real, except, he says, no, not at all. I am saying that these sacrifices are offered to demons, not to God, and I don't want you to participate with demons. Seems like a fair thing. Don't want you to participate with demons. You cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and from the cup of demons too. You cannot eat at the Lord's table and at the table of demons too. What Paul is saying is, these idols are not real gods, and yet, in the spiritual world, there are those who are enemies of God, who act in ways in the world, and this is what makes up idolatry. So Paul is saying, I agree with you. Idols are not real. There is one true God. And yet, there are spirits that are demonic, that are at work in the world, and you cannot go and participate in a worship service designed for this. Remember, I said that Paul uses this rhetoric where he agrees with them and then he kind of flips it on them, right? So he agreed with them. Idols are not real. And they're like, okay, Paul agrees with us. Don't drink at the cup of demons. Okay, Paul disagrees with us, right? Like he's trying to communicate to them, this is not okay. So he answers clearly in that. Eating meat in the marketplace. He says, yes, mostly. So you may eat any meat that is sold in the marketplace without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Paul says, because God is God over all, we are not only concerned about just sacred things that happen within the church, all secular things are God's as well. And you can eat meat in the marketplace without asking any questions of conscience. So yes, you can do that. However, we have to balance that with what he said in chapter 8, which was, if what I eat causes another believer to sin, I will never eat meat again as long as I live, for I don't want to cause another believer to stumble. So his answer is yes, you can eat meat, you can eat meat in the marketplace without even questioning it. You have that freedom. But he's also saying, don't exercise that freedom if it's going to hurt another believer. So we'll get into all that, but that's his answer for that. And then eating meat in a home, he says, similarly, yes, mostly. If someone who isn't a believer asks you home for dinner, accept the invitation if you want to. Eat whatever is offered to you without raising questions of conscience. But suppose someone tells you this meat was offered to an idol. Don't eat it out of consideration for the conscience of the one who told you. So, he says, yes, you can go do that. You can go, if you want to eat in the home of someone who's not a Christian, that is totally fine. Don't make a big deal about it. Just go, eat what's offered to you. However, if someone tells you this meat was offered to an idol, now we don't know the context of that quote. Is that another Christian who's there with you who says, hey, I think that meat was offered to an idol? And then Paul's concern is for their conscience? Maybe. Or maybe if they gather together and the host raises up the piece of meat and says, this has been offered and let's offer more prayer to this God, then he says to decline it. Just don't eat it. Now, he doesn't say that you should storm out of the room. He says, just don't eat it. That's his answer for this. So we have the answers here, but the question is, how do we apply this to our situation? Because I'm sure all of you are like, well, now I know what to do at Thanksgiving. When we gather together, I know what to say. No, right? Like, this isn't the context we live in, though Christians have to face these kinds of questions around the globe today. However, that's not really the question that we have. So how do we lay this out? Remember, in 10:31, he said, whatever you do this to the glory of God. So it applies to us. And his overarching aim is that in the wilderness that we find ourselves in life, we are to practice hospitality. We are to be a hospitable church. So I'm going to walk through 3 things about what it means to be a hospitable church. The first is cultural competence. Paul says, you say, I am allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. You say, I am allowed to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. Don't be concerned for your own good, but for the good of others. So you may eat any meat that is sold in the marketplace without raising questions of conscience. For the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Paul's laying out the same thing that we've been saying, right? That in answering these questions, my answer cannot simply be, I am going to do what I want. My answer has to be, I have to care about my neighbor. I have to care about my neighbor. And in specific, I have to care about my neighbor and where they come from. Right? Don't give offense to Jews or Gentiles or the church of God. I too try to please everyone in everything I do. I don't just do it what is best for me. I do what is best for others so that many may be saved. He identifies 3 groups of people here, right? Don't give offense to Jews or Gentiles or the church of God. Signifying that certainly he has said in 1 Corinthians, or he's going to say in chapter 12, that the church is made up of Jews and Gentiles, right? But he identifies Jews, Gentiles, or the church of God. Meaning he has in mind those who do not follow Jesus, who come from a Jewish background, who come from a Gentile background, and those who come from a Jewish background or a Gentile background who are part of the church. He has in mind all 3 of those categories. Christians and non-Christians, and those who come from Jewish background and those who come from Gentile background. In order for us to answer this question to the glory of God, doing all things for the glory of God, and not engaging in idolatry, but imitating Christ, we must seek cultural competence. We must seek cultural competence. He said, you say, I'm allowed to do everything, but he says, not everything is beneficial. Not everything is good for you. Not everything is good for your neighbor. Well, how am I to know that? He says, I try, don't give offense to Jews or Gentiles. I too try to please everyone in everything I do. Don't give offense to Jews or to Gentiles. That means you need to know what gives offense to Jews and Gentiles. You need to be aware of the culture in which you live in order to not give offense to it. Now, Paul says, don't just get cultural competence, understanding your culture so that you can defeat them, or that you can flout that culture on purpose just to make them angry, right? There's this approach sometimes from Christians, which looks like Ellie's face, right? My cat's face, my previous cat's face, that the gospel is offensive, so I can be offensive too. The gospel offends people. They're just offended by the gospel. Well, maybe, or maybe you're just kind of a jerk. Like that could be also why they're offended, because you are giving offense. He says, I try to please everyone. Think about this. He identifies non-Christians and Christians, and he says, my aim is to please them. My aim is to please them. What cultural, ethnic, racial understandings do I need to have to love, to engage, to be hospitable to, in order to share the gospel with people? This is great timing, Matt's presentation on design. This is exactly what Paul's talking about. If I'm going to preach the gospel to people, I need to understand how they think about the world. What things are valuable to them. And if there are things that are valuable to them that are not an essential doctrine of the church, then let's give value to it. Let's give value to it. Let's care for and understand and try to not give offense. And it's not like a bait and switch, ends justify the means. The only reason I am hospitable to you is so that I can share the gospel with you. No, he says, I try to please. He also said, everything is the Lord's. So I can actually experience Jesus by understanding people's culture, because God is Lord over all. And He has created people in His image, and they have created culture which represents God in a way that no other place represents. Now, all cultures get some things wrong, and all cultures get some things right, and we can come and understand those things and actually engage them, but that means we have to actually care to engage them and try to please everyone. Hospitality in the wilderness means trying to please those around me. That means honoring, celebrating, knowing, and loving the cultural goods of people who are different from me. That's why we do these monthly highlights throughout the year. It's not because we're trying to give some sort of nod to some pursuit of diversity. It's because we actually care about the cultures of the world and the cultures of our city and of our country that we want to reach with the gospel and that we want to love. And we do not know all the things about those things, and so we need to learn. We need to take a humble approach to culture. We need to, God in His majesty and wisdom has created diverse and beautiful cultures around the world, and there is much to celebrate and to love and to enjoy. And we do this so that we don't cause added offense. Paul, maybe a quick summary of what Paul is trying to say is, learn to not say and do dumb things when you interact with people of another culture. Learn to do this, right? And the burden that Paul says here is actually on you to do the learning. Paul's not saying, hey, when I show up in a city and there are Jews and Gentiles, I do whatever I want, and then when someone says, hey, that was really offensive, then I change. Sometimes the way in which we seek to pursue cultural competence is we show up in a place and assume, and this is primarily geared towards my majority culture, brothers and sisters. This is what we do often, what I do often. This is our approach to the world, is to show up in a place and say, the world adapts to me. The world just has to adapt to me. Everyone around me who's not like me has to adapt to me. And therefore, if I do something offensive, I didn't have any intention to be offensive, but did I have an intention to not be offensive? That's the question. Did I have intention to go in to actually please, to actually care about, to actually learn about, to actually know about? And the burden is on us to do that learning before we engage. We might have to actually do some work. Part of being a mature Christian is not simply learning more and more about my Bible. That is absolutely true. But also engaging in the culture of the world around me so that I know how to actually love my neighbor. Right? The great commandment is to love God and love neighbor. If I love God and I just say, hey, I'm going to love God however I want to love God. Well, no, that's not okay. God is God. And we ought to love Him and know Him in the way that He has revealed Himself. The same is true of loving my neighbor. I can't just be like, well, you don't like the way I love you? Too bad. That's not what Paul says. He says, I try to please everyone. What we need to develop is an Imago Dei curiosity. Imago Dei is this doctrine that all people are created in the image of God. They reflect God's glory, regardless of whether they're Christian or non-Christian. They reflect God's glory in a way that no one else in the universe does. And we need to develop a curiosity around people who are made in the image of God. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And people are the pinnacle of His creation. So let's develop a curiosity around it. In The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis says, next to the blessed sacrament itself, referring to the Lord's Supper, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Your neighbor is the holiest object you're going to see today. That includes the neighbor who offends you, the neighbor who you don't like, the neighbor you would prefer to give offense to. They are the holiest object presented to you today, apart from the Lord's Supper. We need to come in with less judgment and more curiosity. We need to be less hostile and more hospitable. As our culture in particular moves to more and more post-Christian, there's a lot of different answers to how Christians should handle that. How should we respond to a culture who increasingly is moving post-Christian? There are lots of answers out there. We could withdraw from culture. We could become just like culture. We could be countercultural completely or overthrow and overcome culture, or we can insulate ourselves from it. Whatever merit there is to some of these approaches, the first response must be more and more hospitality. More and more hospitality. That's what Paul would say. Remember the context in which Paul is writing. He is saying, you have to imagine this. Paul is not saying, go into the world that we inhabit today and try to please everyone. He says, go into the world and try not to give offense to those who are worshiping idols and sacrificing meat to idols all around you, all the time. And also sacrificing to the emperor, and if you fail to do so, you might actually face some really hard things. Right? Remember, Paul, in almost every place he shows up, there's a riot, or they kick him out, or all these other things. Paul's not saying, in the midst of a hospitable culture, go and be hospitable. He's saying, in the midst of a hostile culture, go and be hospitable. How much more for us? In this day, in our culture, we have no excuse to not be hospitable. Paul says he tries to please everyone. Jesus certainly flipped tables, yes. And that's the favorite thing to say amongst those who like to be offensive. Well, Jesus flipped tables, yeah. But he did that once, and amongst the religious leaders who had gotten it wrong, not amongst the non-Christian leaders. He didn't walk into Pilate's office and flip a table, right? That's not what he was doing. He actually set more tables. We have to engage in deeper friendship, more hosting of parties, more showing up in the lives of our neighbors, more freedom to engage in the world. We need to be more hospitable. Now, we need to be more hospitable to Jews, to Gentiles, and to the church of God. All of this, engaging in culture, being aware of culture, engaging with our non-Christian neighbors and understanding who they are and understanding their cultural background, but not neglecting the church of God. If your answer is hospitality to the world and only flipping tables amongst the church, grace out there but judgment in here, well, that will leave you bitter and vulnerable to idolatry and compromise. It will leave you bitter. No offense to the world, and no offense to the church. You see, the challenge is that most of us like being offensive. For some of us, it's that we like offending non-Christians and being brash about things. For others, it's that we like offending those folks. We would rather catch someone being offensive and showcase them and showcase their hypocrisy and offend them intentionally rather than love them and not give offense to them. Paul says that God's glory is more important, and the person made in the image of God, whether they're offensive or not, is also more important. I do not just what I want to do, but what's good for my neighbor. Winning a person is always better than winning an argument. And that likely means if I leave an interaction with a person, online or in person, with an attitude that says, well, I really stuck it to those guys. I won that one. There's probably some people clapping and liking my comment there. They really like what I said there. I really got them on that one. We're probably not trying to honor that person, love them, and win them to Christ. But actually, we're gaining pleasure at their demise. It's not really about truth or God's glory, even though we might say it is. It's really about my pleasure in owning someone and winning an argument, not in trying to please them and win them to Christ. You see, actually, if we are to pursue what Paul says and trying to not give offense to Jews, Gentiles, or to the church of God, it leaves us likely not having the ability to run to tribes and get fans on our side because we won an argument, but actually leaves us in a place where we seek to serve and love others. Where we just seek to serve and love others. This is the absurdity of Paul's hospitality. The pleasure of others at my expense, rather than my pleasure at the expense of others. The pleasure of others at my expense, rather than my pleasure at the expense of others. This is the first principle. We need cultural competence in order to be a hospitable church. The second is that we need to do things all to the glory of God. Whether you eat or drink, do it to the glory of God. Now, the first and most important thing for us to be hospitable is not cultural competence. We started there, but that's not the most important piece. The most important piece is that we are hospitable to the glory of God. Paul begins this chapter with a discussion of Israel's past. I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. All of them were guided by a cloud that moved ahead of them, and all of them walked through the sea on dry ground. In the cloud and in the sea, all of them were baptized as followers of Moses. All of them ate the same spiritual food. And all of them drank the same spiritual water, for they drank from the spiritual rock that traveled with them, and that rock was Christ. Yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. These things happened as a warning to us so that we would not crave evil things as they did, or worship idols as some of them did. As the scriptures say, the people celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. And we must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did, causing 23,000 of them to die in one day. Nor should we put Christ to the test as some of them did and then died from snake bites. And don't grumble as some of them did and then were destroyed by the angel of death. These things happened to them as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. Now, the first thing that Paul does here is a masterpiece of biblical theology. Actually, in engaging in this argument, Paul uses biblical theology, this idea of connecting themes and ideas throughout the whole of the Scripture. He uses that for the sake of another argument. It's kind of like an aside for him. But this is actually where we get some of the most powerful pieces of biblical theology is in this chapter, and it's used by Paul for an argument against them worshiping idols. Doing all things to the glory of God. He says that you, the church, and the Old Testament people of God, Israel, not the modern state Israel, the Old Testament people of God, known as Israel, you, the church, and them are the same. There's continuity between who the church of God is. And he does this by actually showcasing the same sacraments that we practice. Baptism and the Lord's Supper. Right? What does he say? They were all baptized into Moses. When they crossed over into the Red Sea, this is a theme that comes up in the New Testament of when they are engaging in the Exodus, when they are leaving in the Exodus, as they walk through on dry ground over the Red Sea, the New Testament authors call this a baptism of water. Very similar to our baptism, our exodus from old life into new life. And that they ate and drank this spiritual food, which was Christ, which is exactly how we describe the Lord's Supper. And Paul is about to talk about the Lord's Supper in chapter 11. He's connecting these two things to say that the church of the Old Testament is the people of God in Israel, and the church of the New Testament is still the people of God. And actually, you're even more similar because you are in the wilderness. Why does he choose the wilderness? Often, New Testament writers actually choose this period of time for the people of God. Doesn't choose when they're in the height of their kingdom under Solomon. Because that's not the place that you're in. You're in the wilderness, wandering around from home. You're not yet home. One of the issues that arises for the church, whether in the Old Testament or throughout history or in the present moment, is being too at home in the world. When we're too at home in the world, idolatry settles in. Now, the second thing that Paul does in this is he outlines examples for the church that address the very questions that Paul is addressing. So the first one he addressed was drinking from the spiritual rock, yet God was not pleased with them. And we'll get to this in a little bit later, but there's this story in which the people of God are traveling around and they're complaining that they need water, and Moses hits a rock with the staff, and water comes out to feed the people of God, to give them drink. And what he says is, they drank from the spiritual rock, which is Christ, and yet God was not pleased with them. What he's saying to the church is, being a part of the people of God does not mean that you cannot displease God. Remember, this is part of their argument, is we have freedom. We can do whatever we want. If the gospel's really true, I'm really forgiven of all my sins, I am coming, I take the Lord's Supper, I'm good. I can do whatever I want. No, that's not how it works. Being a part of the people of God does not mean everything you do is okay. And this references eating and drinking, just like what they're dealing with. The second example he gives is the worship of idols, which is the story of the golden calf, right? And we walked through Exodus as a church, and we spent some time in this passage. God's people have been delivered. They go out. They're in the wilderness. Moses goes up on the mountain to meet with God. They see fire and lightning come down from heaven on the mountain. They're right in front of it, and they're like, man, Moses is taking too long. Like, he's right there. For all of us who say, man, it would be so much easier to follow Jesus if he was right here, maybe not. He's right there. They're waiting on the law. And then they come to Aaron and they say, hey, make us some gods. We need some gods. So Aaron gathers together some gold, and then when Moses comes down, right, Aaron gives the famous, most applicable thing that anyone caught in any sin says, I don't know how it happened. I just threw it in the fire and this came out. That's not how crafting an idol works. You actually have to mold it. Aaron, you were responsible for this, right? But this is how we respond, right? All the time when we're caught in sin, we're like, I don't know how it happened. And in this, the people of God quickly turn away. But what do they do in the midst of that? Well, they're eating before the idol. And it said that they engage in pagan revelry, which is probably translation for some sort of cultic sexual immorality that was happening in front of the idol. It's likely what was going on. Which is describing the exact thing that's happening at the temples around them. Paul's like, guys, we've done this, we've seen this before. God answered this. He was not pleased with that. You can't go do that. Right? And remember, in chapter 5, he talked about going and visiting prostitutes, which probably is temple prostitutes. And now he's talking about eating meat in the temple. He's connecting the same thing. And he's like, hey guys, our history tells us this does not end well. You cannot go do this. This is not okay. He then moves on to another example of sexual immorality in which the Israelites are traveling around and the Moabites, another people group around them, tempt Israel both into sexual immorality and feasting in front of the Baals, gods, idols. Exact same situation. Both of these examples probably allude to the same thing that's happening in Corinth. And then there's this thing with snake bites. Well, there is this section in which the people of God are complaining against Moses because they're eating only manna. They're like, hey, we're in the desert and we would like better food. Now, meanwhile, remember, they're in the desert and God is providing them bread every day. Magically. Miraculously. He's providing for them manna from heaven, and they are complaining. This is bad, right? It's like, kids, if your parents make you dinner and you're like, I don't like this. Well, you didn't make it, So like maybe gratefulness first, and then we'll talk about what you like, right? Like the people of God are grumbling against them, and snakes come out and bite them, and they have to make a bronze serpent that they hang on a tree, and everyone has to look to it, and they'll be saved. They're grumbling. There's another section of grumbling. Likely, Paul is highlighting the way the Israelites grumbled against God and Moses, just as the church is grumbling against Paul's instructions. And it didn't end well for the church. In a world full of pagan worship, temple prostitution, meat sacrifice to idols, emperor worship, persecution against them, what is Paul concerned about? He's not concerned about all the sinners out there. All the stories he highlights is not of the world sinning, it's of the church sinning. In the midst of all of those things happening, these examples are not really an example of, see, look, the problem is there's idol worship around us. If we could just get rid of the idol worship around us, we'll be fine. No, the problem is we worship idols. We are tempted to worship idols. Paul's concern in bringing up these examples is not to say, look at the evil of the world out there. It's to say, we need to look at us. The chief problem is not the culture around us, but the idol factory that is our hearts, as John Calvin says. As Israel is wandering in the wilderness, their chief problem is their own idolatry. That's what he had said earlier about sexual immorality. Paul's concern is for their hearts. And then Paul specifically addresses their situation. If you think you are standing strong, be careful not to fall. The temptations in your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so that you can endure. So, my dear friends, flee from the worship of idols. You are reasonable people. Decide for yourself if what I am saying is true. When we bless the cup at the Lord's table, aren't we sharing in the blood of Christ? And when we break bread, aren't we sharing in the body of Christ? And though we are many, we all eat from one loaf of bread, showing that we are one body. Think about the people of Israel. Weren't they united by eating the sacrifices at the altar? What am I trying to say? Am I saying that food offered to idols has some significance, or that idols are real gods? No, not at all. I am saying that these sacrifices are offered to demons, not to God, and I don't want you to participate with demons. You cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and from the cup of demons too. You cannot eat at the Lord's table and at the table of demons too. What? Do we dare rouse the Lord's jealousy? Do you think we are stronger than He is? We need to recognize our tendency towards idolatry and recognize the subtle ways in which it comes in our lives. And we need to recognize those things and bring that before the Lord humbly. If we are to do this, we must go to Christ likeness. This is the final point in being a hospitable church. Paul ends this. Actually, this paragraph is in 1 Corinthians 11:1. It ends, but it really fits with this. And just a good reminder that the chapters and verses are not a part of the original manuscripts, right? These are added later. And so sometimes it's unclear why this choice was made. But this clearly fits with the first section of this. And you should imitate me just as I imitate Christ. If we are to be a hospitable church, we must do all things for the glory of God. We must learn cultural competence, and we must do all of that in a posture of Christ-likeness. We must have a humble posture, a posture that embraces self-denial and love as our highest aim, particularly because Jesus is the answer to our idolatry. You know what helps us to have a humble posture and not give offense to others is to recognize our own sinfulness, our own tendencies towards idolatry. But we need an answer for that. If we're to give the world an answer for that, we first need an answer for that. The story about the snake bites. In John 3, says this, "And as Moses lifted up the bronze snake on a pole in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up. Paul knows what he's doing in bringing up these stories. You see, for the church in the Old Testament wandering around in the wilderness, they needed a Savior outside of themselves. Paul doesn't say, church, you've gotten it wrong. Work harder to get more cultural competence, and you can do it. You can be hospitable. Work harder and don't stumble into idolatry. No, what did he say? God will make a way out. You need a way out. And that way out is Jesus. Just as the bronze serpent was lifted up and everyone had to look to him, so the Son of Man will be lifted up. What did they hang the bronze serpent on? On a tree. The Son of Man was hung on a tree. He was hung on a cross in your place to die for your idolatry so that you can be made right with God. If we are to be hospitable, we need to look to Christ. Christ, he says, is the rock also, right? The spiritual rock, which is Christ. This story in Exodus 17 is crazy. But tormented by thirst, they continued to argue with Moses. Why did you bring us out of Egypt? Are you trying to kill us, our children, and our livestock with thirst? Which is just, they were in slavery in Egypt, right? They were enslaved. And they're like, no, can we go back? Moses, why'd you take us out here? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what should I do with these people? They are ready to stone me. The Lord said to Moses, walk out in front of the people. Take your staff, the one you used when you struck the water of the Nile, and call some of the elders of Israel to join you. I will stand before you on the rock at Mount Sinai. Strike the rock, and water will come gushing out. Then the people will be able to drink. So Moses struck the rock as he was told to do, and water gushed out as the elders looked on. What did Paul say? The rock was Christ. What did God say? I'm going to stand on the rock and you hit the rock. The implication is that Moses strikes God to provide water for the people. That God himself takes the burden to free the people and to provide for the people. Why does Paul call us to try and please everyone, to not give offense, to be hospitable? Because that's what Jesus has done with us. Why does Paul say it's okay for self-denial? This is not your home. Don't try to just please yourself and do whatever you want, but think about the best for your neighbor, because that's exactly what God has done for you. When you had need, when you were dead in sin, God said, I will bear the punishment deserved. I will step in. I will be the one who is struck for you. Now go and do likewise. Hospitality for us to the world comes because Jesus has provided himself to idol worshipers like us. Those of us who are prone to worship idols are forgiven by Jesus. We get to be hospitable in the wilderness because Jesus is abundantly generous with us in the wilderness. Because Jesus provides for us. Because when we get it wrong, we don't have to say, it's over, I'm canceled, it's done, I can't ever do this again. We get to just repent and come close to Jesus. We get to humble ourselves. Actually repent, turn from it, and come near to Jesus who has provided himself for us. So the only way that we will be hospitable and engage in cultural competence and do all this for the glory of God is if we get close to Jesus. If we come and drink from this rock which is Christ. As we come and share in the unity of the Lord's Supper together. As we come near to Jesus and he comes near to us, we can have the freedom to go near to our neighbor and love them. So let's do that together. Let's pray together. God, we are a church in the wilderness, meaning that we are in a place of needing your grace and mercy. We are in need of your love and your care. We are in need of you to provide for us. So Jesus, would you provide for us? Would you be the spiritual water of our lives? And Lord, would you transform us for your glory to be a hospitable people?